So good afternoon. Sorry for that delay in getting us started today. But just as a reminder, I would like to invite you to our next History for Lunch, which is Wednesday, May the 1st. We will have Mr. Jeb Stewart here with his new book that has just recently been published, titled Big Al and Me, Partners in Mischief, Capers, and Shenanigans. But today, we would like to welcome Mr. J. Timothy Allen, PhD. He is professor of humanities at Strayer University, and he will discuss North Carolina Quakers and coastal North Carolina Quakers and slavery. So, Mr. Allen, thank you very much, and we hope you enjoy your talk, and we hope that our guests enjoy too.
Hey.
Yes, ma'am.
Volume knob over here, does that need to be on up or is it go somewhere?
No, it should be, the volume should be good. Can you hear it now? Okay. Okay. Hold on just this. There you go. I'll let you go ahead and I'll be right back.
All right. Well, thank you for Laurie for getting all the tech stuff going. So and thank you all for coming, and I'll try to talk louder so till we get the microphone thing going there. So as I say in the commercial, can you hear me now? So that's we'll try that. Again, thank you for having me here, and before I get going, I need to do a legal disclaimer, and that is you've got me down for being a professor at Strayer University. I actually retired 2 years ago. But Strayer is real big on not getting sued. So I have to state the following. Keep in mind that I no longer work for Strayer, and so everything I say up here, my opinions and conclusions do not represent the university in any way or any of its institutions. So hope that'll clear up the lawyers and get them off their backs and go forward. So, Quakers and slavery, or actually for you guys, northeastern North Carolina, Quakers and slavery. Interesting topic. I've stumbled upon it in some way, so we'll kind of get that going for you here. First off, I need to bring you greetings. Let's see, Lori, it's not moving, so let's see if I can. Here. There it goes. Welcome from Snow Camp. That's where I'm from. If you come to the Piedmont area of North Carolina, halfway between Chapel Hill and Greensboro, and 16 miles south of Burlington and 12 miles north of Siler City, which is where Aunt B is from Anna Griffith's show, you will stop in Snow Camp at the one of two stoplights we have. Not the regular stoplights, the blinking ones, you know. So there was a story years ago in the 1800s where a fellow was traveling through and he stopped at the local blacksmith. He needed his horse reshoed. And as they were talking, he says, by the way, I'm looking for a place called Snow Camp. Can you tell me where it is? And the blacksmith looked up at him and said, well, sir, you're standing right in the middle of it. So that's how big we are. But Snow Camp is important because it has a connection here. 1749ers, some settlers came in from Pennsylvania and they found some nice lands in the Piedmont area there. 1750s, they came back with their families, and in 1751, since these were all Quaker folks, they sent a group down to Perquimans and came to Little River meeting. Also, they called it Carver's Creek. I'm not sure which one it is. And Rachel Wright and Abigail Pike asked if that meeting would sponsor what would come to be known as Cane Creek meeting. They agreed, and so Rachel and Abigail rode 200 miles back on their horses, and Cane Creek was started with permission from the folks here in the Perquimans area. So that's why I'm giving you greetings from Snow Camp. If you want to come to Snow Camp, you will have a restaurant, 2 churches, the Snow Camp Rago gas station / hardware store / all kinds of other stuff, post office, and the Dollar General. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. All right, let's go forward here. How I got here. Some of you may have read my and Steve Miller's book, Slave Escapes and the Underground Railroad in North Carolina. We were working on that and really focused on the Underground Railroad. What we found out was in North Carolina, there's not really an organized system of Underground Railroad. That's more northern. There was some organization in the middle of the state, but down here on the coast, we didn't find hardly anything except slave escapes and some very loose connections with Quakers. So Steve and I were limited to 50,000 words in that book. We have plenty more we wanted to discuss, but the editors chopped us off, so we had to stop. Steve pursued some other things, and I continued to read up on Quakers and also the Underground Railroad, and began to find some things I had not seen before. And writers, as usual, are telling their spouse about all this as you eat dinner. And while my wife has wanted me to pass the salt, I'm babbling on about Quakers and slavery and things like that. She says, wait a minute. I thought Quakers were against slavery and therefore would not have slaves. And I thought, there's the next book. How many of you have thought that or were taught that in the past, that Quakers had no slaves? All right, that's what I thought. How many of you were taught that all Quakers were involved in the Underground Railroad? All right, good. Only a couple of you there, so we're ahead. That's good. So what we're going to do today is talk briefly about some northeastern North Carolina Quakers and how they were tied into slavery and how they began to move away from slavery. I'm going to stop the discussion right about 1800, plenty more after that, but after 1800, most Quakers in eastern North Carolina, especially here in this area, began to move to Ohio and Indiana. And so their connection with slavery and eventually underground and maritime railroads was disconnected there. So that's where we'll stop. All right. George Fox began Quakers. The date 1647-ish is when he began preaching. He was part of a movement in that time period. The Glorious Revolution was one thing happening in England. The battle with Scotland was also happening as well. The Puritans were leaving England and heading over to the Americas, and they were settling, of course, in New England. We all know that story. And the Puritans were supposedly the new wave of Christianity, I guess you could call that. And roughly 1650s or so, probably 1655 or 56, some missionaries from Quakers in England and Ireland began to come over as well. They settled in New England. They also came to other parts of the world, the Barbados area as well. And I'll get to more of that in a minute. I'm already running ahead in my little notes here. Quaker beliefs. We need to know these because they're important for slavery. We can read these. Inner light. Quakers believe that you might say religion comes from within, that God's light or spirit is within you. And so what that translates into with slaves is that they believed slaves also could have the inner light. And so they were in one sense seen as equals with the Quakers. The equality of all. Quakers didn't believe in social hierarchies. That, of course, made the English very upset with their deference policies and their idea that if you are of the aristocracy, everybody else must bow down to you, that sort of thing. Quakers were against that. And slaves, of course, ran into that issue as well, constantly having to show deference to plantation owners. Quakers were very industrious and lived simple lifestyles, much like the Puritans. This industry will get in the way of Quakerism and slavery, as we'll see in a little bit. Open worship, and this is also important. Quaker worship, if anybody here Quaker? Good. Okay, I can talk about Quakers then. So I live in a Quaker stronghold, so I've gotten used to Quakers. And one thing about Quakers is the word peculiar starts popping up when you start working with Quakers, and they know that. They will tell you that right up front. Quaker worship, traditional Quaker worship, is you go and you sit, and you sit, and you sit. Someone may get up and have a revelation or a word to share. They may not. And so when the leader of that particular meeting decides that they've met long enough, they'll ask if all consciences are clear. If so, then they will leave the meeting. Well, this is a stereotype, but enough African-American scholars have voiced this one. Most Africans were not of that ilk. They believed in a more emotional style of worship, song, movement with dance. I hate to say raucous, but in the eyes of Puritans and others, it would seem to be rather raucous as well. You can imagine taking your slave to a Quaker meeting. And in fact, one slave, Olida Equiano, you may know of his story, was taken to a Quaker meeting, and he said, I was bored to tears. Nothing happening. Quakers were pacifists. We probably know that story fairly well. And so in all, these characteristics will come up as they interact with slaves. All right. George Fox timeline, I just put this up here to kind of give you an idea of how things work there. Again, 1647 is when he begins to have these intimations of a different style of worship. 1650s, again, England was in a mess with wars and battles. They began to work to the colonies in mid 60s, maybe very early, 50s. And let's say 1653, 54, 55, somewhere in there. Barbados, West Indies is where they went. And also, like I said, to America. And Elizabeth Harris was one of the ministers who came to the colonies, again, 1655 or 56. The dates are a little bit iffy. All right, George Fox is often cited by Quakers as a person who was against slavery. Not really. George Fox, when he was in Barbados and then coming to America as well, he taught several things, and they were treat your slaves well. And Quakers overall did that. He taught them to teach their slaves basic skills, reading and writing, some sense of a profession, and also religion. And the point was, at this particular time, slaves were not held for life, at least the ones that Fox was talking with. They were held for a certain period of time. And the notion was you train them so that when you release them, then they will fit in with society and they will not become a burden to society as well. That's what Fox taught. All right, William Edmondson was also along with George Fox. He likewise said the same thing: treat them well, educate them, teach them religion, skills, what I'll call civility, and then manumit as well, okay? Later, William Edmondson changed his tune and went to full manumission, full emancipation after that. So the point here is that Quakers from the get-go were connected with slavery. They owned slaves and they were working within themselves to make sure that within the Quaker discipline to treat slaves well and to treat them as human beings and to hopefully get them ready for a life of within the regular community along with that. All right, persecutions of Quakers soon erupted. Quakers, quite frankly, are odd. If you've ever been around some today, you'll feel a bit of that. But back in the day of Fox, Quakers could be rude. Quakers quaked when they had their inspiration, so to speak. That was odd, especially in England. Quakers are very self-righteous in those days, extremely self-righteous. They were called the Puritans of the Puritans, so you can imagine how far that went. They were in New England. Eventually, they were physically tortured by the Puritans. Some were killed. Some were physically abused, as in ears cut off, that sort of thing. Many were beaten. And so they fled, like the Baptists, to Rhode Island and settled down there. And also in Virginia, as Quakers began to emerge in Virginia, most of them were converts called convinced Quakers. But in Virginia, you had the Anglican establishment. And so, again, Quakers with their very emotional style or non-emotional style of worship, were seen as an aberration according to the Anglican Church. So they were persecuted as well. Again, notice some connections to slavery. Slaves were considered rude and obstinate by their white owners. Slaves were tortured physically, emotionally, psychologically, and slaves were harassed by governments who continually made more rules against slavery as well, right? So in essence, Quakers had an idea of what slaves were going through based on their own past history. All right, Quakers were very industrious. If you read any book on Quakers, the word industry will pop up soon after you say the word Quaker. They were known to be hard workers, known to be people with multiple occupations, multiple businesses. We'll see more of that in a minute. That was good in one sense. As they moved to North Carolina, farms for a typical Quaker might have been 600 acres, maybe some more, maybe less. That was a starting point, and then others began to add more land after that. Diverse businesses, it could be farming, it could be cattle, sheep, ferry services, shingles, brickyards, shipyards, on it went. And they were ever expanding their industry more and more. Of course, you need workers to have an expanded industry as well. So slaves were brought into the Quaker community, not a lot, handfuls at a time. And they helped Quakers to continue to grow with their industry, continue to make money, continue to be prosperous, which led to a rise of affluence and power. And we'll see more of that in a second. All right, getting to where we are today. This is a pic of the Dismal Swamp, but thought it was kind of neat to put that one in here too. Quakers, they came in pretty much there. If you live in the area long enough, and I'm assuming most of you have, you've heard about Quakers in the area, Quaker meetings, and Quaker meetings that have been put down, laid down, and then other descendants of Quakers as well. So coming into the Albemarle, the Pasquotank, and the Perquimans area, I hope I said that right. So people in the Piedmont sometimes mess up the names a little bit. Settling there, again, small farms that turned into big farms along with that. Let me check my notes very quickly. I'm sure I've skipped something along the way. From this, we meet the first documented Quaker. Anybody here kin to any of the Phillipses? No, good. Henry Phillips, I've seen it spelled both ways. We think moved from New England down here about 1665. He was not the first Quaker here. He's just the first documented Quaker that we found here. Others were escaping persecution from Rhode Island, and so they came down here as well. Others escaped persecution from Virginia and came down here and settled. 1672, William Edmondson came by on a missionary tour from the Quakers, followed up by George Fox. They came in about the same time, but traveled a little bit separately. And Quakers were very big on traveling to visit other Quaker meetings. If you read their stories, oftentimes a Quaker in a meeting would feel led to go and visit other Quaker meetings. It was a way for them to stay connected, a way for them to share information, to share discipline, to share differences in doctrine, and to oftentimes keep up with kinfolk as well. Quakers were known for this. Even today, if you're looking for genealogy, go find a Quaker, because they can probably send you to the place where you can find more about them or your family that had moved to Ohio or Indiana or other places, west and south. All right, small farms, plantations, as I've said, 3 times now. They brought servants and slaves with them. This is where we're getting some territory that's going to be a little bit iffy. Typically 3 to 5 slaves and or servants. It depended on the person. It depended on the situation. You may have 1 servant and 4 slaves. You may have 2 servants and 3 slaves. It just depended on the family and the situation involved. At this time, the slaves were treated fairly well. I've not found any instances written down, recorded, where a Quaker was condemned for treating slaves badly. I've often found sources where they were told to treat them well. So when we get to John Woolman in a minute, that will change some, but initially Quakers seemed to treat their slaves fairly well. All right, we have some names here listed. I'll read them to you. I'm not sure, well, you might read them. Francis Toombs, his name comes up differently. 8 slaves and some servants. Patrick Henley, 11 slaves. Captain John Hunt, 6 Africans. That's the way it was listed in the literature, and 1 Indian. The Thoreau brothers, I have no more information than Thoreau brothers. 2 Africans, 4 Indians. Notice how Indians were also considered slaves or servants as well. Timothy Clare, 3 Africans, 2 Indians, 2 servants. Edward Mayo, 3 slaves. And one odd note for Simmons or Simons, I've seen it spelled both ways, meeting where it says they were manumitting slaves as early as 1709. So while some Quakers had slaves, other Quakers did not. And you can begin to see a little bit of a division within Quakers here in the northeastern part of the state. All right, again, a little iffiness here. I'm very well aware of the 1619 movement and how some scholars are going back and reminding us that slaves were slaves no matter when they were brought in or what they were doing as far as folks go. But legally, in this time period with Quakers in North Carolina and also in Virginia, slaves and servants were the same thing. A servant was owned for maybe 3 to 7 years as an indentured servant and then let go. Slaves were purchased, and up to this point, were held for a certain time period and then were supposed to be let go. That will change about 1715. So under early North Carolina law, slaves and servants were basically the same thing, except in name and except in time for service to the owner. All right. Okay. Anybody been to the new old White House? All right. I was there yesterday, treated well by the staff. I had my private tour. What else can you expect with a private tour? So I spent 2.5 hours talking with Lynn about the house itself. I had some questions about slavery. And I wanted to point out this house because the story is Quaker Joseph Scott came in and purchased the land in 1684. So my dates may be wrong there, depends on the source. And later on, the land was sold to Quaker Abraham Sanders, who built the famous brick structure. I've got it in here for one reason. It's ostentatious, according to Quakers. All right. Brick houses were deemed to be of the rich, and the rich wanted to show their wealth. And so you built a brick house as opposed to a plank house or something on that line. To give you a perspective, in my area in Snow Camp, we have something called the Allen House. It's a wooden structure, a little smaller than this one, primitive compared to this one as well. And it had a bottom story and then a loft. The family did all of their work in eating and living in the bottom part. Mom and dad slept in the bottom part. The kids stayed upstairs, and they had quite a few of them. From that house, they ran a business and a small farm along with that, but it's much smaller than this and much more crude than this. So, did Sanders have a lot of money? Did he make money by using slaves? That raises some questions, and those questions will be very important for us here in a little bit. Second Quaker migrations. Stole this map from David Soselsky. Y'all know him? Hope so. He's Waterman's Song book he wrote, and I've read it 3 or 4 times. It's a wonderful history book of the watermen here in eastern and coastal North Carolina. I stole this from his blog. I sent him an email asking where he got it from. He said it was public domain, so I think I'm okay. But anyway, that's where I got it from. This is around the Core Sound area, Beaufort, Morehead City, in that particular region. And Quakers from Rhode Island, starting to see that name over and over again, came down to escape persecutions. And also, in this particular case, with the Core Sound meeting, there was plenty of wood for building of ships and also for making barrels and shingles. And so some moved down to take advantage of that. 1723-ish, give or take a year or two. And the Quakers would have been, I'm going to show you 2 spots. The Williams family and the Borden family moved down here. They were the big ones, and I'll talk more about them in a second. But here's where they lived. Right there. Right. They made money, tons of money. And so, again, this raises a question. I'll give you a quote here in a second. Why did frugal Quakers, why did simple Quakers all of a sudden start making money, buying more lands, expanding their businesses, and living this ostentatious lifestyle? What was it about this? Glad you asked. Here's a quote from 1920. Neva Jean Speck, this is from a Quaker article, and she says, friends from Core Sound seemed less concerned with upholding the Quaker disciplines as strictly as their counterparts to the north in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. All right. That fits in with a mentality that I run into quite a bit here today, especially as a teacher of history and religion and humanities. A lot of people assume Northerners did not have slaves, right? I'll cover that in a second, but it's wrong. Even Northern Quakers had slaves back then. And also the assumption is that Quakers up north followed their discipline strictly and never strayed from that. That's not correct either. Quakers in the South followed the discipline somewhat strictly, others did not. But to assume that Northern Quakers were the pious ones who did nothing wrong, and to assume that Southerners had slaves and did everything wrong is simply just not correct. I'll show you why in a second. All right, Rhode Island. We've mentioned that name again several times now. 60% of the American slave trade, could be shipping, could be making of manacles, that sort of thing, came through Rhode Island of all places. I never heard that before. There was a series of plantations around Narragansett, and those owners wanted to live the lifestyle of Southern plantation owners. Therefore, they had lots of slaves, large plantations, numerous slaves. Pennsylvania. Of course, Quaker William Penn, he owned slaves, but he was against slavery. And the Quaker elite in Pennsylvania, starting off early 1700s, they lived the Quaker lifestyle, simplicity, frugality, that sort of thing. But as the years went by, as they became more involved in politics, also religion, and in society in general, they began to make more money and to claim their status as politicians, as sort of an aristocracy around Philadelphia. And one of the signs of their affluence was to own a slave or two or three or four. So we see here again, slaves were not just in the South connected to Quakers, they were connected to Quakers all up and down the East Coast. I mentioned Olaudah Equiano. He published a wonderful story in 1789 called The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano. He was a slave owned by Pennsylvania merchant Robert King. And in his description of Robert King pretty much treated him well, but Robert King lied a lot. He said he would release Olaudah. He did not. Olaudah requested release. He did not. On and on this went. And so to the point that Olaudah said, I don't think he's a good Quaker. He's not doing what Quakers normally do in treating his slaves well. Also, Robert King was a merchant. He had at least one ship, possibly more, and he was known to pick up a cargo of, say, oranges, wood, barrels, and slaves, and take them to another port and sell them along with other goods. Olaudah was kind of irked by that because he didn't think that King was treating people equally, and also the whole idea of Quakers not treating slaves well, buying and selling them, it didn't seem to sit well with Olaudah. He was ahead of the time. Okay, two prominent coastal North Carolina Quakers, and these are down, let's see, get my story right. These were here in this area, I think. Henry Stanton, 1721, owned 3,000 acres. Some acreage was purchased and slaves were included in the package. Shipyard, turpentine, orchards, vineyards, you can see how diverse his company was, and also made bricks. And he deeded his slaves to his son Benjamin along with that. Robert Williams, 1765, 1,000 acres, owned a salt works, had stores in New Bern, Beaufort, and Newport. Notice the name Newport, by the way, Newport, Rhode Island, down here. He too lived in a brick house, but it was plain, whatever. And he also lived a plain lifestyle. So you begin to see some distinction between Quakers who lived well above their status as a Quaker, and Quakers who had money but tried to keep their simplicity for everybody to see. One thing I did not mention when I looked at the Quaker discipline was they were very strong on how we look outside. What do people think of us? How do they react to our lifestyles? My mother would have loved them. Mom worried about everything, how people thought about her. Quakers were big on that. So if you had a nice house, was it too nice? Was it too bricky? Did it show too much of your affluence to other people? Robert Williams freed his slaves in 1780. Remember that date, because around 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, Quakers in the state of North Carolina began to release slaves, but there was a reason for that, and we'll get to that in a second. If you've been to Beaufort, you might have been to Beaufort and see the boarding house down there on the waterfront. Big house, really nice. My wife and I go to Beaufort quite a bit. We always stop and look at it and think, oh, to have a house like that. And oh, to pay the taxes in Beaufort to pay for that house. So, William Borden I came to the area in Corsound to pursue more wealth, more business. He began to accumulate slaves. His son William Jr. is the one we really want to talk about. In the 1790 census, he owned 43 slaves. At that time, he was called the largest slave owner in Carteret County. I'm supposed to say the right word. And the Borden family overall owned over 21,000 acres. And you can imagine the amount of slaves it needed to tend that particular acreage as well. This house, the original Borden house, was very small. It was added onto until it came to this size here. I'm not sure why that slide is up there again, but we'll skip that. Oh, we're going backwards. It's supposed to be cool. There we go. All right. Things changed. from Quakers can have slaves, but treat them well, educate them, and eventually release them, to ownership of more slaves, rising up in lifestyle of wealth and buildings, acreage, businesses, to some sense of maybe this isn't right, according to Quaker discipline and according to Quaker simplicity. The culture in North Carolina began to shift around 1710, 1715 in there. It shifted in several ways. North Carolina at the beginning was called a slave culture. It had slaves, but it didn't have plantations, large plantations like you would have in South Carolina and Virginia. South Carolina and Virginia will be called slave societies. Some sort of difference for scholars, not quite sure what the difference is. But it began to shift as more and more plantation owners came, especially to southeastern North Carolina with the larger plantations in the Cape Fear region. The mentality began to swerve a bit, and more slaves were brought in that had to influence Quakers along with that because peer pressure, that sort of thing. Also, we've mentioned that Quakers began to buy more and more lands. More and more lands means more and more slaves. And so even Quakers were beginning to participate in this particular shift. And as I've mentioned several times, Quaker successes led to lavish lifestyles and even a brush with aristocracy among other non-Quakers in the area. As the economy shifted, it began to move to a slave economy. And here was the deal. For some reason, around 1715, 1720 or so, the economy ran out of white indentured servants. Well, to be successful, you got to have a worker. And so Quakers began to buy up more slaves, as did everybody else in North Carolina at that particular time. Also, I've heard this in my region in the Piedmont, and I've heard this in several instances in sources down here, that Quakers said out loud to other people, I can't compete with a neighbor who is non-Quaker, who has slaves. I can't compete with them economically, so I will get more slaves to beef up my profits. I was talking with Lynn yesterday at the New Bowl White House, and we had a discussion about this. And I was talking with Lynn, I said, that raises a question about Quakers. If Quakers felt that slaves were equal, if Quakers were supposed to live simply, not lavishly, not ostentatiously, then you would think it would click in, okay, I'm not making the money because I can't get enough slaves. I need to turn my slaves loose, manumit them. Why not just go back to a simpler lifestyle and live the Quaker lifestyle again? Wouldn't that come up in the conversation somewhere? It didn't. We'll see what happened after that. So with this change in worker culture, slaves were brought in initially from Guinea. I mentioned that for a reason. Remember I said that Fox, Edmondson, and others, part of their philosophy, according to slavery, was to teach them, to train them, and I used the word civilize in there intentionally, because the slaves from Guinea were very belligerent, very bellicose. They were warrior types. They fought against the white owners. They often ran away. So in the white mindset, they were uncivilized. And so from Guinea, here comes this population of slaves that Quakers can't control. They can't discipline. They can't teach them religion. Also, other slaves were brought in as well. And so you put all this together, and all of a sudden you have a slave culture that is emerging in North Carolina, moving from the indentured servant to the slave culture in general, and Quakers were part of that. All right, what changed? Quaker consciousness began to be pricked. In the North first, in New York, 1681, in Germantown meeting, which is right near Philadelphia, 1688, came out with a daring statement saying slavery was wrong, you must manumit now. That was bold in 1688. 1690, I've mentioned William Edmondson several times. He changed his tune from educate them, teach them, train them, release them, to manumit now. So you begin to see a shift there right around 1700, 1690, 1680s there. John Woolman came into the picture. I've got this picture of John Woolman. He's not real handsome, is he? Pointed nose, pointed chin. There were other pictures, but I like this one because it just seemed to capture the moment. I'm sure his family and descendants are not happy with that. John Woolman came along. He came from Perth Amboy, which is in New Jersey, which is just below New York City. I mentioned that for a reason. New York City had lots of slaves. They found mass graveyards with slaves in them, slave remains. In the Civil War, during the battles that took place here in the South and the arguments that took place in the North, New York City leaders, especially in the textile industry, were making money on Southern cotton. So they were pro-slavery, oddly enough, and also had this ring of leaders, politicians, crooked types who would capture free blacks in New York City and send them south to be sold again. So who would have thought that? The reason I mention that is John Woolman had to know of slave treatment from New York City because he lived so close by there. Woolman was a business owner and a very successful one. Uh-oh, here we go again. A Quaker who works hard, makes money, and now is wrestling with the fact that I'm a Quaker, I work hard, and I make money, and it seems to be pulling me down from my Quaker beliefs. Hold on to that thought. The trigger for him was when his then boss asked him to write a bill of sale for a slave. And Woolman could read and write, his boss could not. So while writing this, he thought, how strange that I'm writing a bill of sale for a human, treating her as if she is a tool or cattle or something like that. That hit his conscience pretty hard. From that point on, he wrestled with this idea of slavery and the anxiety it produced in him. Right? He took a travel from New Jersey down south, and he eventually made it to North Carolina. I'll get to that in a second. In his journal, which is published in 1774, interestingly enough, he discusses Indians a lot. In New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, he really worries about the Indians, and you're kind of scratching your head going, what was it about Indians that triggered these thoughts and led to your writing about them in his journal? When he gets to North Carolina, he begins to worry about slaves. Interesting. That intrigues me to no end. What was it about North Carolina slavery that made him start using the word slave? He had some distinctions in his writings. If he met with a slave, encountered a slave on the farm, if a slave served him in some sense, and the slave was treated well, he called that slave a servant. Interesting. If he figured out that the slave owner, Quaker, was treating his slave badly, he called that person a slave. So there's a distinction here. Again, why in North Carolina? They had slaves in Virginia who were treated cruelly. Maybe it didn't trick in his mind or something like that. I don't know what happened there, but it caused him a lot of worry. But the one thing that comes up in his journal over and over again, and it's never talked about in Quaker histories. Let me take a pause there. If you read Quaker histories, most of them available today, you can't find because you don't know they're out there. They're published by the North Carolina Yearly Meeting. And they're typically very pro-Quaker, obviously, because they're published by Quakers. And when I began to do research on Quakers and slavery, it popped up in my head. First off, they never talk about Northeastern coastal Quakers, rarely. In one history book, they get that much, literally a paragraph, compared to 3 or 4 pages in that particular time period of Piedmont, North Carolina Quakers. So there's a hole that has to be filled. The other part of that, though, is that Quakers rarely talk about the rise of the affluence of Quakers and what it did to their Quaker faith, especially in regards to slavery. What they do talk about is Quakers owned slaves, and so therefore they began to rethink ownership of slaves and to move towards manumission. But Woolman harped on something over and over in his book, more than he talked about slavery and the problems with that. What he talked about is that in his eye, the ownership of slaves, the use of slaves, began to make whites lazy in their everyday activities. Please bring me my newspaper. Please bring me my cup of tea, that sort of thing. You read that in plantation writings of non-Quakers. And I'm always amazed at how lazy those people were. You can't get up and get your own tea. You can't go get your own newspaper. That's just plain lazy. But that's what Woolman saw. And so as he addresses this, he also realizes Quakers in this area were getting lazy in their faith. They were backing away from simplicity, moving more towards an ostentatious lifestyle, pewter plates, ruffles and buttons and things like that. You've heard that story with the Puritans before, but they were buying nice furniture. Their houses were luxurious. And so go back to the New Bold White House. Places like that, in Woolman's eye, would have been, oh, that's way too much for a Quaker to be doing this. So he constantly questioned that. I'm thinking that while Woolman gets a lot of attention for his statements against slavery, what really bothered him was slavery was causing Quakers to become slaves to this lifestyle, to wealth and prestige and that sort of thing. In fact, Woolman began to say, there's two forms of slavery here: Quakers who own slaves and Quakers who are owned by the institution of slavery as well. And we'll see that when we get to the end of the lecture, that Quakers in this area began to leave the society because they were frankly very tired of being owned by the slave culture that was around them, right? Getting back to Woolman, 1754, he writes a brief little tract on removing Negroes, manumitting Negroes, abolition, that sort of thing. Wasn't very well known, but it seemed to do a trigger within Quakerdom as well. He also wrote a tract with Anthony Benezet where they asked for the same thing, to start manumitting slaves in a gradual sense. Gradual is very important here. All right. We moved from Woolman, again, back to this area here in Paquimans. Woolman began writing against slavery 1750s or so. His journal came out in 1770s. What I've noticed within Quaker responses to slavery is it takes a strong voice like Woolman to write something. It takes about 20 years for it to kick in very well. And so George Walton, who was a convinced Quaker, it means he converted, had dreams. If you read his dreams, they're weird. It's like, this guy's crazy. He's nuts. If you're a psychologist going, wow, this is great, because I can interpret this thing and see how odd this person was. But he has these dreams. He's convinced that the dreams are telling him that slavery is just wrong, period. So he begins having dreams. He writes letters to people. He keeps a diary. And he begins to take up the crusade against slavery within the Quaker stronghold here in North Carolina. He encouraged Thomas Newby, 1774. Walton was married into Newby's family. And Walton also served on the North Carolina yearly meeting committees that were working to abolish slavery as well. He influenced a lot of folks to manumit their slaves, but there are others who did not. Why didn't they do that? Why wouldn't they see their slaves as fellow people, equal in the sight of God? There's some reasons for that. And George Walton will be fighting these reasons as well. So one person of note, George Walton, comes along. There were more publications that popped out. Again, notice the dates. Thomas Nicholson, 1767, a little bit earlier than 1770s and 1780s, wrote an open letter to North Carolina friends. He also pushed for gradual emancipation. In this publication, he begins to give a list of reasons that Quakers were now standing against slavery. Slave trade is wicked. That would make sense, wouldn't it? It introduced pride and idleness and paternalism, which is exactly what John Woolman said. It contradicts Quaker peace. Let me explain that. To steal a slave, to capture a slave in Africa and haul that person over here was non-peaceful. It was tough, it was mean, it was persecutorial, it was bad, and it violated the Quaker idea of peace. Selling a slave also was not peaceful, and treatment of slaves in harsh ways was not peaceful along with that. He noticed that despite Quaker attempts to take slaves to their meetings, it wasn't working. They weren't converting because, as I said, most of them were bored. It just wasn't their style of religion to begin with. So he suggested keep slaves until they're ready to be released. All right, key word there. Keep them until they're ready to be released, which means train them, educate them, convert them into a religion, and set them up so that when they are released, they'll be productive citizens out in the world and will not become a burden to the people, as in so poor they had to be taken care of or that sort of thing. However, unruly slaves should be sold. So again, a little bit of a difference here. Treat them well, get them ready, to manumit, but if they're mean, sell them, they'll be taken to the deep south where they'll be worked to death. So some iffiness here. Results. Anybody related to the Peel family here? No? Good. Rich Square meeting, which is not exactly coastal, it's more towards Halifax area. John Peel of Rich Square meeting had 60 slaves, sorry, mid-1700s. His son, Edmund, released 125 of his slaves. Now notice this, he paid $25 a piece for them to be taken to Liberia or the Caribbean or to Ohio. That's important because one reason for gradual emancipation was it was expensive. In North Carolina, if you manumitted a slave, you had to pay a bond. It varied depending on the time period, but $100, $200, $500, that's a lot of money if you own a lot of slaves. So you have to get the money up in some sense. If you can't get the money up, then you have to keep them as slaves. Gradual emancipation comes along there. Also, during the 1810s, 20s, 30s, Quakers began to try to colonize various areas like Africa. And so they were sending slaves there. The project didn't work too well. In fact, some slaves who were sent there sent letters back and said, please quit doing this. It's not doing the job. We don't like it here. We're being recaptured and sold back into slavery again. That's when Quakers began taking them to Ohio, Indiana, and other places along with that. So that was one result. Some movement to rid themselves of slaves and some to keep them there depending on the situation there. Thomas Nicholson, 1775, also from this area, wrote a letter, and in the letter, he espoused some interesting ideas. Notice the part there on the right. He stressed immediate emancipation. The notion was to give the Quaker a clear conscience. If you are clear on slavery, then you have released your slaves, given them their freedom, and your conscience will no longer be bothered by owning of slaves. Okay, very good idea. The problem was this. Notice the date, 1775. And I'll read the quote. We have faith to believe that the God whom we endeavor to serve is able to preserve those whom we do set free from falling into the hands of cruel and wicked men. But whether he will or not, speaking of God, we will no longer be concerned in that cruel Babylonish practice. What he's saying is, I'm going to manumit, it's up to God to do the rest. Doesn't that sound mean? Again, think of Quaker principles, treatment of others as equal, peace, that sort of thing. But here they've reached the point where I've got to clear my conscience. It doesn't matter what happens after that. I'm going to be free in my mind as a Quaker. They've got to take care of themselves. Here was the deal. As Quakers in this area released their slaves, sheriffs rounded them up, sold them right back to other people as slaves. There again, gradual emancipation until we get this problem fixed. Emanuate fully and quit worrying about it. And whatever happens, that's God's problem. See the trick there? It's very hard to understand the mentality unless you look at the broader picture of the legal implications that were happening here along that line. But still, I just have to scratch my head. Come on, you got to be kidding. That gets me all worked up. Results, mixed results. I've got several slides on this. I mentioned Thomas Newby, 1776, 1777. The process for Newby started earlier. Lynn at the Newell White House told me about this yesterday. He's a Quaker or descended from Quaker, so he knows a little bit about Quakerism. And he was telling me, Newby, in order to rid himself of his slaves, to manumit his slaves, there was such a large number of slaves, 14 in fact, that he had to go to the Quaker meeting to get permission. That's how much the Quaker meeting had control over you. Went to the Quaker meeting in 1774. He says, I feel led to manumit my slaves. Quaker meeting said, we're not sure about this. Peer pressure around here, the thought of recapturing the slaves, on and on. Let's refer this to the quarterly meeting, which they did. Quarterly meeting says, we're not sure about this, same reasons. Let's send it to the yearly meeting. Send it to the yearly meeting. They put it in committee. 3 years later, it comes back, and finally, Thomas Newby is given permission to manumit his slaves. Most books say he had 10 slaves and he manumitted. That's correct. He actually had 14 slaves. But there were some qualifications. If he freed his slaves, then the freedman had to pay him a yearly fee or be sold. So there again, a little bit of an iffiness here as far as releasing the slaves. We don't know if the other 4 were children or if they were elderly. If they were, you would keep them there because they couldn't take care of themselves. However, records show that he did release Hannah, who was very, very old, we might say decrepit, invalid in some ways, and he sold her to avoid the upkeep, which is again very, very sad as well. So Quakers weren't quite as anti-slavery as we made them out to be, at least in this time period. All right. More mixed results. I mentioned the 14 friends who released. I did not mention that. Friends, along with Thomas Newby, there were 14 of them together, released 40 or so slaves initially. Big move. At least that's a step in the right direction. Others in their meetings in this area were very sympathetic. We get it, but for some reasons to not release slaves. One of them was the fear of slave revolts. I'm reading a book now written by a scholar whose last name is Morris. He's written a history of the Dismal Swamp and the Maroons who lived there. I did not know this, but Maroons from the Dismal Swamp would come out in raids and raid people in this area. Raid their cattle, steal their sheep, raid the house, steal money, capture folks, even kill former slave owners as well. So in this time period, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, you begin to have the fear of slave revolts, along with everything else that I've mentioned, the reselling of slaves back into captivity as well. Also, they began to have what they call meetings for blacks. They tried to set up some meetings in this area that were separate from white folks. So the white folks would go to their meeting, black folks would go to their meeting. And again, Quakers would say that slaves were equal, but they weren't. And some of this may have been due to the fact that they knew slaves would have a different kind of spiritual experience than the whites. Some of it may have been very frankly racism along with that. We don't know for sure. The minutes aren't really clear on this, and there's not much information on that. Also, remember the dates: 1774, 76, 77, 1780, 1782, 1784. American Revolution is taking place. The British are coming. The British are coming. They were all around this area. And the British were literally advertising, hey, slave, come over to our side. We'll treat you well, give you some land after the war. You can whoop up on the people who owned you, get your revenge. And the people here were scared of them. So do we manumit and take a risk that they'll come back and kill us? Do we keep them here and take better care of them so they will hopefully take care of us and not defect over to the British? See all the gray areas that we're talking about here? It's not clear cut to say just release. There were too many things that could potentially happen that made people rethink the whole idea of manumission. More mixed results. Jack Swamp meeting, 1794 minutes. There's a note in there that says their slave owners benefited from their slaves' abilities. I'm not sure where that's going. Does it mean that we're not going to manumit slaves because we make money off of them? Or does it mean as we manumit, we're going to lose this ability to make money? I don't know where that's going, but at least they listed it in their minutes. All right. Postal slaves were released, many. And this all began again in the 1770s or so. Sort of a movement, starts off slow, picks up steam after that. The sad thing was that others were still in bondage. And at one time, 134 slaves were released. And sadly enough, all 134 of them were captured and resold. There again, do you keep them as slaves, treat them well? In one sense, give them their freedom while holding them still in bondage? Do you let them loose and say, you're on your own? I don't care anymore? What do you do? Other Quakers began to wait for better circumstances. And that's a little bit beyond where I can go here today because I'm about to run out. Actually, I think I've run out of time, but they waited for better manumission results. What can we do to ensure that when we manumit our slaves, that they will be taken care of, that they can stand on their own, they won't be recaptured? North Carolina legislature fought this. Every time the Quakers made a move, the legislature invented another law to counter that. And for about 10 years, 20 years or so, Quakers like Newby, Nicholson, and others who manumitted only to have their slaves captured, fought and raised petitions, went to the legislature begging them to please allow freed slaves to stay free. It didn't work. So now what? Again, right around 1800, nothing's working. The good intentions fell apart. The bad intentions kept them as slaves. Do we release them and free our conscience? Let God handle the rest? That seems irresponsible, and of course, it was bad for slaves. Did we circumvent the whole legal system? Well, every time they tried, North Carolina legislature came up with something else to confront that. But there was also another problem. Slaves were very big on following the law. That's why when the revolution took place, they were not for the revolution because the British were in charge of the nation. They were in charge of the laws. And because God has put you in that situation, you submit to the authorities that are in control at that time. To go against the law violated Quaker principle. So do you violate North Carolina law and release your slave and do a good thing? Or do you be a good Quaker and follow the law and keep up a bad thing? One way they tried to go around that was to send petitions off to the North Carolina legislature and to the federal government as well. Do you help the runaways? More and more slaves ran away. Well, if you help them, that's considered stealing property. Again, by law, a slave was a tool, a piece of wood, a cow, whatever. And so if you help a slave run away, you're literally, in the Quaker mindset, stealing something that was against biblical law. Colonization, that would be tried. It didn't work very well. As I mentioned, people who were taken to Africa, Liberia, other places, often were captured and sold back into slavery. Sometimes the farms they were sent to were basically slave camps again. The freed slaves were treated harshly. And so slaves began to say, please stop doing this. We don't want to go there anymore. Which led finally to what David Soselsky has called the Maritime Railroad. In this area, there's not much writing about Quakers, particularly helping slaves escape. But we know that slaves using the waterways around here, using their connections with ship owners, with shippers, and other people who were sympathetic with their cause to escape slavery, they began to meet up with these folks and to organize ways to get themselves out of here. And often slave networks, slaves who were on plantations, also worked with these slaves who were running away and helped them to scoot out of this area and find freedom in other ways. So you see the complications of Northeastern Quakers and their ownership of slavery, ownership of slaves. They're dealing with slavery and they're trying to release themselves from the institution of slavery and also to release their slaves on top of that. Extremely complicated. It wasn't like you just say slaves are freed, go your own way. It just had more depth to it than that. Getting back to the question, were Quakers against slavery? Not really. But Quakers who were against slavery met wall after wall after wall and had to figure out ways to go around that in order to release their slaves. Final note, late 1700s into the early 1800s, a huge exodus of coastal Quakers began with Contentnia meeting, which is down more towards the lower upper Cape Fear region. Mass exodus. We can't deal with this institution of slavery anymore. Everything we do doesn't work. We're going to just run away and leave everything behind. So they went to Ohio and Indiana. The Quakers who stayed here had connections with Ohio and Indiana. Guess what? Those connections worked well with the Underground Railroad. The Quaker population in this area plummeted, so even Quakers who were sympathetic with slaves and wanted to help them to escape are now gone, and slaves lost one of their biggest allies. Quaker meetings were laid down. It eventually came down to one meeting that still survived here in this area. And like I said, they had the so-called free states, but as slaves and freed blacks went to North Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and other places, those states began to enact laws that forbade slaves and free blacks to come there. And so there again, you run into another wall. And that is where we really run into what we'll call the organized Underground Railroad. It was more of a northern thing to get those free blacks and slaves to Canada, where they were more free than any place else. All right. And put a map up here so we can see all the places that the whites, Quakers went to get away from here: Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania as well. Some went by ship to Pennsylvania and then went west through the trails and what they called roads back then to get to freedom. Others took various routes through West Virginia and even Tennessee as well. All right, that is, one more slide. Others, however, stayed. and they kept the movement going to free slaves as well. Quakers came up with something called the Free Negro Movement, a very interesting idea. They found out through the shrewdness of a lawyer that there was a law in North Carolina that said anybody could donate stuff, as in goods, to a organization, including a religious organization. And so the lawyer figured out, hey, you can manumit your slaves by selling them or deeding them over to the North Carolina Yearly Meeting. Therefore, they aren't your slaves anymore, and the meeting will work to find them freedom and get them out of the state to someplace else. Ironically, the very organization that was against slavery now owns slaves, about 1,200 of them, in fact, all total. Colonization, again, that didn't work too well. Wesleyan Methodists broke off from the Methodists. The Methodists were for slavery, Wesleyans were against, and so some Quakers joined them because Wesleyans were more vocal against slavery than were Quakers. I mentioned the Maritime Railroad. We know about the Underground Railroad as well, and I have a misspelled word, sorry about that. And the Overground Railroad. Many people don't know that slaves and freed blacks were taken in view of people. They could have papers with them, which would get them by. They could have deeds of sale that were somewhat a little bit iffy, and were taken in wagons, or they follow behind wagons up north along with that. One thing to note is that meetings, Quaker meetings, did not ever condone any of these Underground Railroads, Maritime Railroads, above ground railroads. It was an individual Quaker thing. So when you're reading books, Quakers were against slavery, as I read in a lot of histories of local Quaker meetings. Our meeting, blah, blah, blah. As you know, Quakers were against slavery. Actually, no, Quakers were, as we've seen, mixed all over the board about slavery. The daring Quakers who fought slavery further were the ones who worked on the Underground Railroads, and they put their lives in other people's hands as they risked death and imprisonment in working with Underground Railroads. So that is, there we go, finally, the last slide. Put some Quaker silhouettes, they're very popular, and I found an old picture of slaves as well. So just to kind of finalize the presentation, if you have some information that might be helpful for me, please send me a note. I will leave the PowerPoint with Lori, and they can share that with you folks as well. You can contact her, she has my information. And any stories you have that would be helpful for me, even contradictions, I would like to hear from them as I further the story more. And I sent the proposal for this book, hopeful book, to History Press. I haven't heard anything back from them yet, but this will be a major section of that particular book as I look at North Carolina Quakers and their connection with slavery overall. So anything you have to add, I would greatly appreciate that. And I think we have time for some questions and answers. So we'll try that. Lori has a microphone. I'm a little hard of hearing. So if you have a question, let it rip and let me hear it so I can go up. Lori got one over here. Okay.
I have a Quaker background, and most of my family
Mhm.
in this area are Quakers.
Mhm.
And they went to Piney Woods meeting
Mhm.
outside to go there. What I was told
Mhm.
by, not my family, because they didn't talk about it,
Mhm.
but by my age and my parents' age, of people who had been manumitted by my relatives,
Mhm.
like that, was that they would buy slaves
Mhm.
and teach them, but when they bought them, they freed them and hired them as servants,
Mhm.
not indentured servants.
Yeah.
And so if they wanted to go someplace, they wanted to move someplace, it was fine, but they were free people.
Yes, correct.
And that had been that way.
Mhm. Yeah, there again, you have that weird thing where in order to rid themselves of slaves, they bought them in order to allow them to have sort of a free life, even though they were still legally in bondage to the people. And like you said, some were trained, others may have had skills to begin with.
They were paid salary.
Mhm. Yes.
So they were there if they wanted to be there, if they wanted to go someplace else, they went someplace
Mhm.
else. In some cases, they decided, like somebody who took care of my brothers and sisters.
Mhm.
Her mother had decided that she liked taking care of children.
Mhm.
And so she taught her children how to take care of children.
Yes.
It was all paid.
Mhm. Yeah. The same thing happened in my area, in the Piedmont, in Randolph County and lower Guilford County. Many slaves were owned by, oddly enough, even non-Quakers, with the intent of allowing them to have a free lifestyle, to work, to raise money for themselves. Mm-hmm.
And then hired regular help.
Yes, yes. So again, there's that weird iffiness where the lines that would seem to be very distinct are not in some way. So thanks for the information. I've heard some stuff about Piney Woods, but I've not heard that. So that's very helpful. I appreciate that. Other questions? Got to be one more. Oh, sorry. Yes.
How do the Quakers educate their children?
How did they do that?
Did they have schools? Did the kids go to them?
Typically, a Quaker meeting would also have a school where their children would go to, or if there weren't enough, the parents, who are usually very literate, very well read, would teach their children along with that. So anytime you have a Quaker meeting and you're reading about it in the histories, you'll usually see the word school coming up right after that in some sense.
And Belvedere.
What's that?
In Belvedere.
Yeah,
where my
Oh,
husband
mhm.
was shot at,
Mhm.
There was a school in Belvedere.
Quakers are very big on education. That's one reason we have so many records. They could read and write, and they love to make notes of everything. Sometimes stuff you don't even care about. Reading their minutes is boring. It's really boring. Now, I thought I saw another hand, but yeah.
Are you aware of any other studies of various religions and their attitudes towards slavery?
Yeah, I wrote a dissertation on it. So, yeah, a little bit. Mine was on James O'Kelly, who was a Methodist who broke off, and he wrote a major tract around 1784, so against slavery. But yeah, Methodists, I mentioned how some Quakers joined the Wesleyan Methodists because Wesleyans broke off from the Methodists over the issue of slavery. There were some Methodists who were in this area who were sympathetic to slaves, and so they helped to get them out as well. But on the other hand, some Quakers joined the Methodists rather than continue within the Quaker fold of trying to manumit slaves. They believed slavery was fine, and so they joined the Methodist Church in order to be a part of that. There were some Baptist churches in North Carolina who also worked for freedom and manumission, and there were a few Presbyterian churches that did that as well, as far as I know. But usually the official policy, especially as you get to the 1820s, 1830s or so, was that we are Southern churches were for slavery, pro-slavery, and at that time also Northern versions of the same church, same denomination would start to come out against slavery. So we begin to see a shift there. Did that help a little bit? Okay. It got really complicated. Southern Baptists, I grew up Southern Baptist, but we came about because of the slavery issue. Southern Baptists supported slavery, Northern Baptists did not. So you have those two branches of the same denomination coming up. Okay, other questions?
In your
Yes, ma'am.
own area, there used to be, I think, an open air theatre that did 2 plays every year about.
Oh, yeah, yeah. We are trying to get it going again. If you're free this weekend, actually next weekend, we are going to put that on. Let me explain. Snow Camp was home to the Snow Camp Outdoor Theater. Started in 1975. James Wilson, who I bought my house from, started it along with his brother. They put on a play called The Sword of Peace, which is a play about Quakers who were against the revolution and stood up against Cornwallis, who stayed in Snow Camp a couple of days and somehow survived. But yeah, that production was put on for years. And then they also had another one called Pathway to Freedom, which is about the involvement in the Underground Railroad in our area of Snow Camp. There are at least 4 different safe places in Snow Camp that we have. So it sort of fell down 10 years ago-ish. The family, Wilson family, could not keep it going for various reasons. A person came in and tried to redo it. He messed it up. Another person came in, he messed it up worse. Now we have Studio One in Burlington, which is leasing the land, and they at least know what they're doing. And I'm working with them to try to get the theater back going again. But in 2 weeks, we're going to put on Sword of Peace for a 3-night stay. So we're hoping to get that going again, but
Showing children how to weave and spin and all
Mhm.
that.
we don't do that anymore. Again, it sort of fell apart. We're hoping eventually to do that, and I'm hoping to do historical tours there as well. Since I know the area fairly well. My house is about 200 yards from one of the safe houses, and it's on the road where we have some other safe houses as well. So one day, we're in a one-day situation there, but we still have some historic buildings, 2 Quaker buildings, an old log house. They say it was a Quaker meeting. It wasn't. It's probably an old barn. A colored schoolhouse, which is an actual schoolhouse. They moved there for Black children and adults. That came about after the Civil War. And we have Sylvan School, which was started in 1866 by Cane Creek Meeting, and also sponsored by the Baltimore Association, which helped to do reconstruction in our area as well. So Snow Camp's a very historic place, very fun place. Yeah. Yes, sir.
There were 2 Quaker meetings that survived in this area,
Mhm.
Piney Woods and Upriver.
I've read some about Piney Woods. My understanding was that the meeting house was burned down somewhere during the time of slavery. That's not correct? I've seen that one too. So I've seen,
I don't know about that part, because I know that one of my grandfathers added a front porch on.
Mhm.
And that front porch is still there. The pine woods.
okay. Again, I'm not sure. I read both of them. So it'd be neat to figure out which one actually happened. And even talking with Lynn yesterday, he was not quite sure about that either. And even about the dates. If it was burned down, was it burned down this time or that time, so whatever. But there was also another meeting, I can't remember the name of it, that apparently was burned down as well. And they think there may have been a movement of pro-slavery people, but again, I'm iffy on that one.
The Rich Square meeting, where it took place,
Mhm.
is now the town offices for Rich Square.
Mhm.
And the meeting moved a little bit north to somewhere, I think, beginning with W. Yeah.
Okay. I know Gwen Erickson, who's the archivist at Guilford College, which is a Quaker college. Her mother, Gwen grew up in Rich Square, and her mother is associated with them too. So I've got some connections there. But other questions, good ones.
Thank you all very much for coming out.
Okay.
Going to be available on
We
the
have,
website.
we have recorded, the YouTube, so it will be available on our YouTube, but, if you want to